probably one of our largest, if not largest. So putting the pressure on. Thanks everybody for showing up. Before we start, I just want to introduce Mackenzie. He's going to be presenting next month. So he's just going to give a quick 2-minute overview or 2-second overview of what he's going to be talking.
I'm Mac. I work at, I coordinate this thing, IGEM, International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition. We've shipped about 100,000 interesting unique bioreactors.
Go ahead. Are you writing? No, it's a video. Just walk past.
Put together it's like a genetic Lego. And Jason talked a little bit about the project last time.
Just go past.
And this weekend was our jamboree. I participated 500 students in the bioworks. And they made cool Lego machines. Came and presented their work. It was a grand prize winner. I'll probably talk more about that. Okay? Yeah. So, I hope
I can't remember the date offhand, but first Monday in December.
Pack this mic in.
All right, so with that, I'm going to talk a bit about ants. First, talking about how ants actually work, and then secondly, talking about some simulation work on them. Also, so I guess the first thing is, so why ants? What's interesting about them? And the thing that intrigues me most about ants is that they do everything by local rules, but they get amazing emergent phenomena. So there's no overseer, there's no blueprints, and yet they get enormously complex behavior. So some of those examples, they can find the shortest distance to a food source. They know how to allocate tasks among the colony. They can even come up with some pretty impressive offensive battle plans when, viewed from overhead, it looks like there's a lot of coordination going on that actually turns out to be of some very simple processes. They can also assess the strength of rival colonies and determine whether or not to engage in warfare. I'm mainly going to be focusing on foraging, but I'm going to touch upon those other things as well. So in terms of foraging, how do they do it? And the answer is they use a couple of things. One is pheromones. Another are using photoreceptors and visual cues. And also they keep track of how far they've gone with an internal pedometer. So in terms of pheromones, they're semiochemicals. So that's chemicals used for signal exchange. It's usually the result of a glandular secretion. And pheromones are used to communicate within a species. If it's communicating with along interspecific lines, then it's an allomone, but basically the same thing. With pheromones, one individual releases it, and another individual or any number of individuals respond to it by tasting or smelling. And it's usually a hydrocarbon molecule. So ants have chemoreceptors on their antennae. They use those to sense the molecules. And when it comes to, when you normally think of something like this, ants seem to be very unique when you think of them using these kinds of chemicals to communicate. But if you look at the entire, the world population of organisms, at least according to E.O. Wilson, more than 99% of species communicate mostly or entirely through molecules. But in order to get that high a number, you have to include microorganisms. And I just wanted to introduce the term stigmergy, which is communicating by modifying the environment. So instead of communicating directly, changing the environment somehow to get a message to another individual. So when ants deposit a pheromone, there's an active space where that pheromone can be picked up. And that's the zone where when another individual detects it, if it's above a certain concentration, that changes the ant's behavior. It's enough for the ant to detect it and then make a decision as to whether it should change its behavior. And you can think of this active space as either being a hemisphere, or if the ant's moving as it lays it down, as a tunnel that moves across. So if you're inside the tunnel, you're in the active space. Outside of it, you can't detect it. I apologize for the volume, and Jordan, apologize again that we didn't bring your the the PA system that you donated to us. But hey, can everybody hear me back there? Should I project even more? Okay. So the threshold concentration can be amazingly low as hundreds of molecules per cubic centimeter. It's almost at the quantal level, where only a few molecules need to hit a receptive membrane every few seconds. So you really don't need a lot of this at all. So if you, the active space is where an ant can pick up the pheromone. So if it just stays in one spot and deposits a pheromone, it'll radiate outward, and you can just think of it as a hemisphere. So if it's inside the hemisphere, it can detect it. But if it deposits it as it moves along, you get kind of an extruded tunnel. I tried to find an image of that, which was about a 30-minute wasted search online. But so for the Texas leafcutter ant is particularly sensitive. If you used 1 milligram of its trail substance, that would be enough to lead a column of ants 3 times around the world. And 1 milligram is roughly the equivalent of the quantity in a single colony. So they're amazingly sensitive to this stuff. You don't need to use much at all. So when ants follow the pheromones, they sweep left and right. I'm sure you've all noticed that when they walk along, they bounce back and forth. And basically what they're doing is they're moving their antennae to the strongest source. So they move it over to the side. When they lose it, they swap it back, and they weave along the line. So now that seems pretty simple, seems pretty easy to implement. But then there's also some other stuff going on, which I don't think is particularly well understood. So if you cut off one of their antennae, they still will follow the trail. So and with a slightly different pattern, as you can see, it's not a sine curve anymore. These sharply bounce back. But it gets even weirder than that, and perhaps ant researchers get even weirder than that, because the next test is if you take their antenna, cross them, and glue them together, they'll still follow the pheromone trail. It's just that their behavior gets pretty bizarre, but they still manage to do it. So there's a lot going on behind there than just checking left, right, and bouncing back forth and having it hard-coded as if it were a Bradenburg vehicle. Or symbol control, I should say, for it. So now, in terms of finding the nest, so that's how they take the trail and can go out to the nest. But what about the first ant that actually finds it, doesn't have a pheromone trail? It has to find its way back home. So there are a couple of ways that it will find its way back. One is a lot of species, but not all, use visual cues. So they actually remember stuff. They look at things and see, they'll see something like a kid's plastic, toy. They'll see that and remember it as a waypoint to find their way home. Most ants are virtually blind, or many are extremely poor in seeing, so not all of them use that. But one thing that almost all of them use is orientation to the sun via polarization. So they basically keep an internal compass based upon the polarization of the sky. And also they have an internal pedometer, so they know about how far they've walked. And they keep track of, they can also keep track of their compass direction, so combining them together, they have an active.
And how does that change throughout the day? Does the polarization change, or
so
the location change?
They track it throughout the day. I haven't read studies about what would happen if you put, say, like a cup over an ant and then waited till the end of the day and released it, if it would get confused. But they're constantly adapting to it through the day. But I can't say anything more about the internal mechanisms. I just basically I'm not that familiar at that level. So in terms of the visual cues, this really impresses me with ants because it shows that they can actually store memories, which is pretty amazing that something that size with such a simple memory can actually see something. Yeah. I forget the number of neurons. It's low. I mean it's. Oh, So I'll be on tape saying this, but it's I believe on the order of several thousand. But I'll definitely put an asterisk on this to look up the actual answer. But off the top of my head, I'd say right around there. So they use these visual cues and can find their way from waypoint to waypoint. So, but polarization is the biggest key. It's of course detecting polarized light in something like the sky is impossible for humans, but ants are very tuned to it. They have special polarization sensitive neurons, POL neurons, and they have specialized polarization sensitive photoreceptors. So as I was researching this bit, I actually found out humans can perceive some polarized light. And there's an effect called Heidinger's brush that you can detect on LCD monitors. That's very bizarre. So I encourage all of you to go to the Wikipedia page on that and then look for it. Because once you see it, you'll be able to see it always. So, but we don't have the skills to track something like it's not going to help you very much if you're out in the wilderness. So in terms of the distance to nest with the internal pedometer, this is where ant researchers get even more bizarre. If you take the ant when it finds the food and you cut off most of its legs, leaving only little stubs, it'll walk back by the proportional distance of how its stride has changed. So if its stride's half as long, it'll walk halfway back to the nest and wonder where it is. Alternatively, if you have, I guess, a team of very patient grad students and glue stilts to their legs,
Glue stilts to ant legs.
They'll proportionally overshoot the nest. This is pretty recent research. This is about a year old, maybe a little bit longer.
There are no insect rights activists?
No, I don't think so. So in terms of how they find the shortest path, when they encounter an obstacle on their way back, some will just, based on distribution, some will choose the shorter path, some will choose the longer path. You know, with even choice, they'll go to either side. But the ants that take the shorter path, they'll arrive back to the nest faster. So it permits a faster flow between the nest and the food source. If you iterate this over time, a higher rate of pheromone accumulates on the shorter path than the longer one. Plus, when you add in the evaporation, the effect's very measurable, and over time you'll just see the longer path basically dry up, and the ants will all take the shortest route.
Ants take the longer and come back.
I don't. No, because they'll know how far away they are because they
go back longer.
No. They'll. I mean, I think I would guess it'd be roughly. If there's a lot more pheromone, I would guess they'd take the shorter. But with a much higher probability. But in terms of the distance, they can wander around all day, moving in all kinds of directions. But they know at any given time how far they are from the nest and what their orientation is. The same octopi do the same thing. They'll wander all around and then take a straight route back once they find the food. I mean, of course, if there are obstacles there, it will be many problems. So here's a little example. In the first step, the trail forms. You put an obstacle down, evenly distributed. Some will take the longer one, some will take the shorter one. The ones that take the shorter one will get back faster. And over time, that brings about more pheromones being laid down. And so eventually, the longer path will evaporate, and pretty much everybody will be on the shorter path. You'll still have some ants that wander around, and you need to have some that don't follow the behavior exactly to find the shorter path in general. But that's the overall effect. So a couple other emergent ant behaviors that I'm just going to touch upon briefly. One is attack formations, another is including individuals, another one is assessing the strength of rivals. So this is particularly interesting that it's something that's seen by the African weaver ant. It deposits 3 pheromones at once. Each of them has a different dispersal rate and a different activation, a different set of activation rules. So ants that are far, so imagine if, say, there's a beetle or something like that in the middle. An individual ant can't fight this thing. It's too strong for it. It'll lay down all 3 pheromones at once. Ants that are nearby, in the innermost circle, they'll start biting anything they see. Ants that are somewhat farther away will all start marching around in the same direction. So they'll start marching either clockwise or counterclockwise and encircling something. And ants that are very far away, they get an attraction message, so they just start coming together. So with that very simple rule set, that one ant is able to coordinate an attack where ants come in from the outside, encircle the beetle or whatever it is so it can't leave, and then the ones in the middle go into a frenzy and just start biting. So they can actually coordinate an attack that when you see it, you feel like there has to be a general directing this or something, but it's actually very simple rules. I don't have a video of that. I've never even seen a video, but I'd love to. We'll have to all YouTube that at some point.
Yeah. Oh no, this isn't actually outside.
Well, so ants are. The question was, there's the test to glue stilts on ants to test that system, but how do you test that they're not just seeing the beetle? I can't vouch for this experiment because I basically read 2 paragraphs about it in the massive ant tome, and that's all the space they had on it. But ants seem to completely ignore other sensory data when they're dealing with pheromones. So the most frequent thing that they do is they extract the pheromone and just brush it onto glass beads, or just deposit it somewhere, or get them to drop it on paper and put it somewhere else. And you can see the behavior. So ants will, they'll, like for example, if you paint dead pheromone, like the scent that ants give off when they're dead, and you paint it onto an ant that's alive, ants in the nest will pick it up and drop it in the refuse pile. And then it'll brush itself off, go back, and then get picked up by somebody else who drops it off the garbage. So
I'm not dead yet.
yeah, exactly. So they seem, they seem to have a series of things they pay attention to. And when they're paying attention to pheromones, the other systems seem to not be very important to them. And even something like tactile stimulation, there are some ants that if you rub their face somewhere, I don't know if it's the base of the antenna or something like that, they'll share food. And so there have been other species that have learned to do this. So like these beetles will just like walk up and start rubbing ant faces, and ants will start sharing their food. So they seem to have very little, when their little mind is going into pheromone mode, that seems to dominate all other things. Can you, is it the question?
Let's say they bite everything here, let's say, stop. Let's say I'm not dead yet.
Yeah, well, so there are some things. There's actually some research that came out recently about putting up like do not enter or dead end signs. So if say you have a branch in a foraging trail with pheromones, and it turns out all of the food's depleted at the end of one of the branches, ants will start dropping off pheromones that say dead end, don't go down this. But that's the only one offhand that I can think of. But, that would count as a cancellation. So now, in terms of recruitment, when an ant returns to the nest, it'll actively recruit only a few nestmates. So it'll share the food in its crop and actively get some ants to follow it. Other ants that are nearby actually smell a chemical that coats their body the longer they stay out in the sun. So if you have an ant that just is removing pebbles from the nest, when it comes back into the nest, it doesn't have this odor to it. But the one that's been foraging for the past hour, when it comes back, it will have that scent, or however long it takes. So when the ants smell that, the ones in the area will go out. So that's one way that they control the number of ants that forage. So the more that come back, having spent enough time to accumulate this scent following a foraging trail, they'll activate more ants to come out. If ants really haven't found anything and aren't returning, then other ants don't bother to go out of the nest to try to find the food source. So in terms of strength of rivals, this is an area that I'm actually kind of interested in pursuing in simulation at some point. But it's unknown, well, with the honeypot ants at least, it's unknown how they determine when to raid rivals. They have a very elaborate, some call it a dance or a ritual that they'll have with the other colony where they go out sparring. And so when they see other ants, they actually try to stand on little pebbles to look bigger, and they get up as high as possible, and they take little jabs at each other, like little kicks and stuff, but they don't hurt each other at all. And this can go on for a very long time. I think it goes on even for multiple days, or it can. And at a certain point, and it's all, nobody kills anybody else, it's very rare. But occasionally, or when one of the colonies realizes that it can overwhelm the other group, it'll go in and it's an absolute fight to the death. They kill off pretty much everything they can find, with the exception of these honeypots, which are ants that are basically immobile, that are just used to deposit food into. So they're these massive swollen ants whose job it is to just regurgitate food. So they'll go in and they'll just take all of these swollen ants back to their nest and use them as a food source. But they'll only do that if they realize they can mobilize an army that's about 10 times stronger than the rivals. And so no one knows how that's really done, but it's estimated that there are 3 measurements that they use. One is the ratio of their nestmates that they meet in these ritual encounters to their rivals. So they might say, all right, for every one of my guys, I've seen 3 of their guys. Another thing is pulling what types of enemy. So there are soldier ants that are much larger and are basically the equivalent of knights or something like that can really mess up regular worker ants very easily. So if they see, there are a lot of the big soldiers. Yeah. So that's by smell. The queen secretes different pheromones that then get passed through the nest. So all of them, all the ants of one nest end up having a different scent. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good question. The question is, do all ants share the same, I guess you could say, like, I don't want to say language of pheromones, but do they use the same set of pheromones, or do they use different ones? And the answer is they use primarily different ones that are slightly altered for some things. Some things are shared, and then occasionally there'll be a match where it means different things. So, they might evolve I don't know if it's as drastic as this is follow a trail and this one means flee, if there's a crossover, but there are crossovers, and I have to confess, when it gets into the detail of the molecular structures, I tend to kind of skim by those details, but there are hits, but one, but there's a lot of similarity, and there's also, but I don't know the exact numbers involved though. But something like pheromone smell, that's pretty unique. I think it'd be pretty rare that they would, the scent of the colony, that you'd have 2 rival colonies with the same scent. I think that's very unlikely. In terms of the trail following pheromone, I don't know what the odds are, but I would doubt it's the same, but Well, the question: if they find another trail, can they tell because of the other ant scent? I don't think it would probably work that way. I think they'd know they're on enemy territory from beforehand because they kind of mark their territory. So I think that. I think before they even got to the trail, they'd be alerted that this isn't their turf. I don't believe that as they drop the trail, they drop an additional, colony marker, but they may. I'm not certain. So this quote I just had to add in there. So this comes from Darwin's The Descent of Man. It says, "It is certain that there may be extraordinary activity with an extremely small absolute mass of nervous matter. Thus the wonderfully diversified instincts, mental powers, and affections of ants are notorious, yet their cerebral ganglia are not so large as the quarter of a small pin's head. Under this point of view, the brain of an ant is one of the most marvelous atoms of matter in the world, perhaps more so than the brain of man." I thought that was a really interesting quote because it's amazing what they can do with something that small. So here's a cross section.
What's our neuron count?
We're at a trillion, right? Or is that connections?
No, I'm counting the ants.
I was asked this before. I'm not. I can't remember, but I want to say it's on the order of thousands.
So basically, humans must be wasting about 99% of them, right?
Yeah. The has about 3,000. So there's amazing complexity here. I really don't know what most of this stuff does. I know there's actually a lot of research being done at BU right now about it. But to me, it's just amazing to just see the complexity in something that simple. And on a gross kind of superficial way, you see and just there are gross kind of similarities. At least there seems to be, and obviously a human does amazingly more complex things, but I think we tend to underestimate what ants can do with their little gray matter. So I think, again, insect level intelligence is very underestimated. Rodney Brooks is kind of one of the major figures in kind of moving people to create systems with ant-like intelligence, said in 1987, "Our goal, worth nothing if we don't deliver, is simple insect-level intelligence within 2 years." I don't think we're even close right now, and that's 20 years later. I think there's some things that we do that on superficial ways simulate, and then there's some things that we do simulating neurons at that level that are pretty close. But in terms of coming up with full systems that have the full range of insect intelligence, I don't think we're there. So that said, they do have systems that are very, very simple.
2 years or 20 years?
20 years, that was 1987.
So we haven't had it in 20 years.
Yeah. So in my simulation, that we're going to talk about in a little bit, I've been really impressed with the idea of having separate systems, have it modular. And we know that there are some insect systems that work like this. For instance, cockroaches, their response mechanism to changing air pressure disturbances is on their thoracic ganglia, as is the motor control mechanism of their legs. So if you take a well-fed cockroach and decapitate it can scurry around responding to local stimuli for up to a month, as its respiratory and circulatory system are also not dependent on the brain. So, these things can run all around and cause an air disturbance. They'll move. So there's people believe they can. They definitely can't. They definitely can't mate successfully. But I believe there's a question as to whether if they're basically almost
Humans can reproduce
lay
in
eggs,
ways, so
lay larvae. And I think the debate's sort of open on that one. I don't think it's ever been. I don't believe it's been witnessed by scientific researchers, but it's certainly out there in folklore. So now I'm gonna talk about my ant simulation, which I'm calling Emerge Ants. It probably would be missing that E, but that website was taken. So here's a screenshot of the little guys. It's a 3D system with lots of little ants. I didn't get around to making a food object, so that's a little picture of the world right there, but that's what they're eating right now. So the goal of the system is to combine multiple systems. So there have been many ant simulations that simulate lots of different aspects. I want to come up with at least a framework so that I can start really combining all of them. So I want to, in my system, I want the two antennae that detect pheromones, want their recruitment, want to have collision detection and response, want to have different types of pheromones, attack and defense, basically anything interesting that I read about that ants can do, I want to at least be able to put into this at some point. I also want to be able to do experiments in the simulation and see if it matches up with experiments done by researchers. And I want to continually tweak it until that gets matched up more. So also want it to be extensible, want it to be used for A-Life simulations outside of just ants, want it very modular. It goes from the graphics engine to the various sense perception systems. So want to be able to just make a new creature, give it the same collision response mechanism that another creature has. All 3D, and also want to be able to push computers hard. I get kind of a really sadistic sense when I'm seeing near 100% CPU usage and making the fan on the video card basically burn out. So the architecture, it's cross-platform. It runs on Mac, Linux, Windows XP. Vista doesn't play nicely with others. Working on that with Jonathan's been helping me a lot with the graphic system, but currently OpenGL is a bit of a nightmare over on Vista. Basically runs on I'm building a game engine it has a separate rendering engine and dynamic library. And again, serve as a framework for all kinds of A-Life experiments. And everything extends generic base classes. So there's another little screenshot of them. And so run through their perceptual system. Oh yeah, I decided, as this is kind of serving as a base for another project I'm doing that I want to have commercially released, I tried to make the ants as cute as possible. But that may change to make...
Oh, I love the eyeballs. Yeah.
So they have a tactile response system, they have a smell system, they have a pheromone system, and a visual system. So the tactile system is basically modeled after having vibrissae, which are basically whiskers. So an ant has whiskers all around it. And the picture shows it. So this is kind of tough to see, but if I turn it on, you can see that there's this rectangle around it with lots of white little dots. And so those are the vibrissae. So if those brush up against another ant, they're activated. Right now it's a rectangle. Their location is independent, but I didn't bother coming up with a code to make it conform to the bottom. But if a vibrissae is stimulated, the emergent receives a force pushing it in the opposite direction. This is an internal force, just in terms of where it's going to move. So if it's hit from the side, it's nudged in the opposite direction. If it's in the front, the amp will slow down. If it's in the rear, the amp speeds up. What was it? Oh, so in order to come up with this, one, read a lot of articles on how collision response is done in video games, but then also spent a lot of time filming ants in my little ant farms and watching ant documentaries and just going through frame by frame, chronicling what happens. Yeah, so it seems like basically what they do is if they bump into one, they slow down. That's pretty straightforward. Sometimes if they have a lot of momentum, they'll plow through, but usually they bump into something and slow down. If they're bumped from the side, they either rotate or they just kind of skid to the side and then continue on. So it's, you're just trying to, not so much in a rigorous scientific manner, but just a lot of observation. Yeah. So the olfactory systems use the same antennae to detect odor and pheromones. All objects have odor, but currently they only respond to the scent of food and nests. Each antenna can also detect nearby pheromones, and pheromones and odor systems are distinct, so it's totally separate code of the head. What's that? It's also with. I mean, I'm not sure if the same. It's definitely from receptors on the antenna. That part's clear. Which antenna pick it out? I'm not positive. Just but it's considered the same system. But in my implementation, they're separate. So the pheromone, they're represented as points, so it drops basically a dotted line of pheromones as opposed to leaving lines. And they detect pheromones just through their inverse square law, so it, as the distance changes. Pheromones also decay over time, and in real ants it ranges, but the standard figure you see is about 10 minutes for a foraging trail.
Wait, how many pheromones does each ant species have in general?
So if you look at literature from like the 90s, it's at 12, and now I think it's about 20.
20.
But I think, but I don't know if that's for all or if that's the total ones.
Just curious, how many pheromones does it take to get this emergent behavior, basically?
Well, for trail following, just one.
Just one.
Just one type. Yeah.
Question is then combinatorial. If I'm trying to get a handle on how big this
I'm sorry, he's
trying to get a handle on roughly how big the language is.
So, in terms of the combinatorics, I've read very little on that, and the reasons I read is somewhat old, but there are some times where they'll drop a pheromone that gets them in a state, and then they get another pheromone, and that brings something out, but it brings about a different behavior than if they'd just gotten it to begin with. But they don't really have what we consider a language, where this symbol is different based on the symbol that preceded it, different than the symbol that preceded it, if that answers the question. So in terms of the implementation, I have a tile system where the pheromones are deposited on a tile. Ants will query the nearby tiles for all the pheromones on it. So they don't, it's not like a cellular automata where each tile has its own value, but it actually is just kind of a bucket that holds it. But the one thing that takes it out of the realm of implementation and where it actually affects simulation, they have a certain threshold where they won't query tiles beyond it. If the simulation slows down amazingly if you keep extending the tiles out. You've got to kind of keep going fast as I'm running a bit late with time. So the vision system is actually implemented. They see all the objects within their vision cone. The cone is defined by viewing angle and a horizon. They can tell the orientation of all the objects within the cone. I'm going to be expanding that to 2 cones, so it's fixed on each eye, and each one has a different viewing cone. So that system is built, it's updated each tick, but currently their brains don't do anything with it. So they just get all the data, and that's mainly because they don't need it for this kind of stuff. So the polarized light system, I'm cheating right now. They remember the nest location and basically know how to get it. They just find the direction to it. Could you cut the music in this room, please? Thanks. In terms of their brain, it's a finite state machine. Their decision making integrates the inputs from the separate systems of perception. They respond differently depending on their state. So when returning to the nest, the ants completely ignore the food scent as they don't need it, they're already full. But when foraging the scent of food, actually I have dominating the trail pheromone. So if they actually smell the food nearby, they'll just go directly to it. So the states right now, they have a foraging, eating, returning to nest, and then a substate for collision response. And collision response dominates the other ones. So they will, first things first, they will avoid collision. So they, when they're foraging, they wander basically according to Brownian motion. If they detect a pheromone, they'll turn in the direction of the greatest strength. If they detect the food, as I just said, that will trump any pheromone, and noise is added to all of these decisions. So they don't actually do that with 100% accuracy. Pretty much, yeah. Well, yeah, so I mean, it's I consider ground animation. I guess maybe it's not technically, but they so I guess giving the presentation, it shouldn't be loose. But yeah, it's more or less a random walk, with the exception that they'll keep within a decent direction. They basically will keep within. If you take the cardinal directions and then add, northeast, northwest, those ones, they basically will stick in that area. So if it's an ant that leaves northwest, it'll basically just search northwest. But as it does it bounces all around.
5 minutes of flash memory left.
Oh, okay, all right. So eating, they stand still and eat, not very exciting. Returning home, they remember the direction and distance back to nest. They head straight back while dropping pheromones. If they collide with another object, they'll avoid the object, but they'll still deposit pheromones. Lately I've been experimenting with ratios of ants that follow the pheromone home and those that find their own path. Because you need both. Not all of them will follow that path. There's a certain percent, I'm using about 5, that will just ignore pheromones and try to go home. The collision avoidance, they respond to the vibrise stimulation, and then there's some random agitation that if they haven't, if they're still in the collision, they'll just kind of start moving around. In terms of issues, they won't walk into each other, but I had to allow some amount of overlap in terms of rotating into each other. Otherwise, gridlock form, so that's something I'm working on. Another big issue is they can bounce other ants off the border of the pheromone trail. So if an ant's on the edge, they bump into each other and it sends it off. Right now it doesn't remember, hey, I was following some pheromones, they were over in this direction, I'll go back to that. They just will shoot off and continue wandering.
Is that realistic then, that they
Well,
bumped an ant off the pheromone trail?
yeah, I'm having trouble finding data on it. There are definitely videos and observances I've had directly with ants where they'll do that. In terms of what the numbers are and what I should be trying to map, I'm not quite sure. So the next step, so far the bulk of the work has been graphics, getting all the systems to be modular, getting everything to be, or getting many things to be data driven. So you load a scene, it just reads it from the XML file and actually builds everything from the camera to the graphics to the lighting effects and where the creatures are, what their states are, all of that is all data driven. And then various optimizations have taken a long time. And there's still a long way to go with optimizations. I've got a powerful machine, and I basically have kept it, kept it at the point of hurt or far beyond that. So it's been a constant struggle, kind of reeling it back in to work on my machine, but also average hardware. So continue improving collision response. I have to balance the performance of the pheromone system. So again, by doing it where you're dropping down points, it can really just tax a machine. I mean, it just gets very large, very fast. And so I have to work on that. There's a certain limit where ants in real life, if there's already a lot of pheromone around them over a certain amount, they won't drop anymore. They're like, this area is completely marked, there's no need to. And so finding where that is and balancing it with performance, it will continue to be an issue for a while, I'm sure. Also, at some point, I'd love to get the recruitment in there, put in the attack and scatter pheromones, and eventually evolve neural controllers. And that's the end of it over time. So I guess now open it up for a couple of questions. Come on.
And genomes, have they been sequenced, and if so, how many?
The quick answer to that is I have absolutely no idea.
I mean, it's probably relevant to this pheromone, discussion of how many, is it a combinatorial thing? How many things are?
Yeah, I just have no idea.
I have a better question.
Okay.
Is this the first full ANT simulation, or how other?
Well, I mean, I guess I guess the answer is right now. It's not even there at all. You know, there are things that have done it. You know, have taken things much further along than where I am. But there aren't any that combine all of the systems that are illustrated there, or even the majority of them. So there's been a long way to go, and a lot of the ones that have combined multiple systems have done it with a really small number of ants, and have been kind of eyeing the world of robotics, where they want to then build it, where they have like 5 or 10 robots or something. But you definitely don't get the nest, the recruitment kind of behavior with any of those implementations.
What
Yeah.
language are you writing it in?
All C++.
Does your system now work where it can find the shortest route around an obstacle using the formal concept?
Yeah. It can if I make a couple of ants basically dead, so that they're just objects that it has to move around. He'll find the shortest route, but eventually the collision detection will break it because things